Today's presentation will be given by Ho-fung Hung. He's the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Wiesenfeld Associate Professor in Political Economy at the Sociology Department of Johns Hopkins University. And he researches global political economy, protest, and nationalism. And he's the author of 2 award-winning books. One is Protest with Chinese Characteristics, published in 2011. And his most recent book, which I believe is also the subject of the talk today, The China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World. And as he told me just now, that was not the subtitle that he chose, but rather the subtitle that the publisher chose, which is Columbia University Press. His articles have appeared in all the top sociology journals, American Journal of Sociology, American Sociological Review, and he's also a well-known cited expert on Chinese politics and also Hong Kong politics in outlets like the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. So today he will be speaking on the China boom. Where did it come from? Where is it heading? Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, and for inviting me to let me have this opportunity to speak to the legendary China Studies and International Studies community in U of Michigan at Ann Arbor. So today I'm going to give a very brief summary of the book, and then I try to condense and simplify things, and then we go on into the question and answer. If you, after the talk, you know pretty much what my book is about, and then you might decide to buy it or not to buy it. But it is quite a recent book, and the China boom is a moving target. That people's view on China, on the China boom, move up and down, and my heart also moved up and down with him when I'm finishing the manuscript, because the book was copyrighted at 2016, but physically it was out in October 2015. So it's like a 1-year anniversary is coming. And so when the publisher gave me the cover in spring of 2015, I'm quite nervous. I emphasize that, always emphasize that it is a deflated balloon, not a pop balloon. So a deflated balloon can be always reflated again. So that somebody is trying to do so in China right now. Because in the spring of 2015, that the China bulls are still running around, and in May of 2015, actually, I was in a meeting with one of the other participants is Professor Justin Lin Yifu, the well-known economist, who used to be the chief economist in the World Bank and chief economic advisor in China, and he's talking about that China still potentially can have 20 years more of average of 9% growth. But he's actually more sophisticated than the press report, because he's talking about the potential growth rate of 20 years of 9% growth, provided that the policy is right, the reform is right, necessary reform is done, and so on and so forth. But the press and other scholars and journalists like to quote him by saying that he's predicting that China is going to have a 9% growth for 20 more years. And his argument is simple. That is the China real per capita GDP now is about the level of Japan in the 1960s and Korea and Taiwan in the 1980s. And then for those other economies, that level of per capita GDP is a kind of is a precursor to 20 more years of high-speed growth. And then so China at this level, if the allocation of capital and everything is done right, can potentially achieve that growth. But of course, that people pick up the conclusion without the details, and then keep saying that China is still high-speed growth is still continuing, and so is as late as May 2015, and of course that after the summer of all this devaluation and the stock market, and people realize finally, after many actually expert of China finance know that it is coming, but people didn't realize until the summer of 2015. Then the book became kind of timely, and as far as I know, that the simplified Chinese translation is coming, and the Korean edition is coming out, and even the Russian edition is coming out too, and the book. Actually, but the book is not only about the future of the China growth, but to predict the future or to make sense of possibility in the future. We need to know how it came about, and so the book is meant to debunked 4 or more myths about the China boom. One is that the origin of the China boom, and in China studies and in many other international studies field, that there's kind of a modern, pre-modern divide, and in the China study field there's a 1949 divide, and people look at what happened after, or 1978 divide, and then people tend to regard all these years, 1949, 1978, a radical break, and then the China boom came, of course, according to many scholars and according to many common layman understanding, is started in 1978 with the market reform. It is a radical break from the Mao period, and actually at the same time there's a separate, somehow opposite view about the China boom that's popular in the last 10 years, is that actually the China boom is nothing new. It is just a revival or continuation of China's centrality in the world in the Ming Qing dynasty, that the so-called California school, with all the scholars who used to be in California, like Kenneth Pomeranz and Bin Wang, still in California, and Andrew Gunnar Frank, who published in the University of California Press, Reorient and Greek Divergence, and so on and so forth. They're all talking about this centrality and strength of the Chinese market economy in the early modern period. So they see that the China's downgrading to kind of a poor relation in the 20th century is a temporary bump, and then now it is just reviving. And many historians and many economists argue this way, and it's even slipped into popular imagination, to be sure, in Martin Jack books, When China Ruled the World, and also Joseph Lai, when he talked about all this kind of a soft power and the coming new world order. He also emphasized that China's economic boom is a renaissance, lot of rise of China, but a revival or renaissance of China. So it is just China moving back to its historic road. So I'm arguing actually against both this view, that China boom as a radical break with the past, or the continuation of the past glory. Of course, that is a more common theoretical explanation of the China boom is actually, I see this as nothing new, because you see it since the 1980s, when people are arguing, trying to explain the rise of Japan and the Four Tigers. So it is the free marketeer at that time. The IMF World Bank published a report in the 1980s is telling people that the Four Tigers are doing so well and Japan is doing so well because they didn't pursue protectionism, which is not quite true, and then they embraced free market, and then the Japanese, the MITI, get a group of scholars to publish a counter report and saying that we are doing so well because of the developmental state. So it is developmental state literature that we're all familiar with regarding Japan and the Four Tigers. And in the China explanation of the China boom, and you can see this parallel debate, that some people say that China is successful because of the market, and some other people say that China is successful and unique because of the state. Of course, there are many more sophisticated view. For example, your colleagues here, Professor An Yuan is talking about the co-evolution of market and state, which is more complicated than most others. What I'm trying to debunk here is that actually China is quite a unique experience, that you cannot package it as a kind of a simple formula to be sold to other developing countries, because of the fact that the China boom actually grew out of a very unique and complicated history. And this I have already talked about, that the China is poised to another 2 decades of high-speed growth, that thanks to the stock market turmoil in the summer of 2015, and also the currency market, that this myth is kind of dispelled by itself, and many China boom turn into China bear nowadays. And of course, another thing is that the U.S. is financially subjugated to China's financial power. That is interesting, that both certain segment on the left and both certain segment on the right all subscribe to this view, that in the left it was manifested in the form of that China is going to replace the U.S. as the new leader of the world to create a more egalitarian and just world order. On the right, you see a lot of people talking about the China threat. That is all this debate in Congress about indebtedness of the U.S. government. So you see these people citing that we are all indebted to China, and we are going to be slaves of our creditor down the road. And Donald Trump, of course, is playing up this China threat card. And interestingly, that when I was finishing the book manuscript in 2014, I believe, I didn't know that Donald Trump is running, but I got Donald Trump on first page of the book because I find a quote of him in 2008. He's a secret admirer of the China model. He's saying that U.S. should learn how China does business. And also that the review so far is still coming out is generally positive, but the negative review actually come from the far right. And one of the person who write quite a negative view of the book turned out to be a foreign policy advisor of the Trump campaign. So if you read the book and you don't like it, it might be your inner Trump lurking. So because they are accusing me of downplaying the China threat, being naive about China's intention to take over the U.S. and rule the world and things like that. And so whatever that, so the first thing is that, and because I'm pursuing this argument, the South China Morning Post has a book review accusing me of orthodox left-wing Maoist, that I'm everything except that. I'm not sure, but I'm just telling the truth and the reality, because my first book, The Protest with Chinese Characteristic, is about the Qing Dynasty, and I start off studying my academic interest in China started with the Qing economic social history, so I'm familiar with the literature about socio-economic growth and market economy in China at that time, and also people conflate two things, that is market economy and capitalism are different things. That in the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, there's an advanced market economy based on exchange of commodities and small producers. And to have capitalism, you have capital. You need to have accumulation of capital. That is, to concentrate surpluses into investment, into technology, and developing bigger organizations, and so on and so forth. And in the age of modern capitalism in the 19th and 20th century is particularly serious, because you need to squeeze the peasants or whoever having surplus, then concentrate it and invest in heavy industry and military industry. It is how the Meiji reform after the success of the reform, they built a strong state to use agricultural taxation to concentrate surplus to build a state-led industries and military infrastructures. So China has been very advanced in its market economy in the 18th, 19th century. And then what happened in the 19th and early 20th century in China is many state builders, state reformers try to solve the problem of how to concentrate the rural surplus. And a lot of economic data coming out showing that actually Chinese agriculture is not as bad as many people thought. That actually despite some war and rebellion infested area, that in the agricultural heartland there's a lot of surplus. The problem is how to concentrate this surplus to invest in industrial infrastructure and military investment and development. So the Republican government and the late Qing government all failed, and then so the Mao period basically is adopting a variant of the Soviet model. Of course, that the Soviet model is all about squeezing the peasants, collectivization to get the surplus out, to pursue high-speed heavy industry and military development, and with a twist. So after the consequence of 3 decades of Maoist development is not only that through collectivization they managed to squeeze the peasants and develop viable infrastructures and heavy industry and military industry, but because of the hukou system and all this investment in barefoot doctors and rural education, that by the end of the Mao period, that large population is still rural, but the literacy rate and also is much higher than other comparable developing countries like India, and also that a lot of infectious disease like TB and malaria and all this kind of disease that trouble many developing countries has been eradicated by the 1970s. Of course, in a way, there was a lot of disasters like the Great Leap disasters and so on and so forth. But by the end of the Mao period, China is equipped with the networks of basic infrastructure and state enterprises that, again, they're a lot fancy. There's a lot of problem. There's still a lot of, when I in my childhood, I spent a lot of Chinese New Year in Guangzhou. That to visit my grandparents there. Then I remember that electricity outage is a kind of a regular occurrence at that time. That like in many developing countries. So I'm not fantasizing. I'm not idealizing it. But compared to other comparable developing countries, the railroad system, the road networks, electricity, and everything by the late 1970s, China is has a pretty decent level of development compared to other developing countries. And also limited external liabilities. That is the thing that many people didn't much realize, because many developing countries, including some Eastern European, Central European socialist countries like Poland and Yugoslavia, they tried to overcome the problem of the lack of capability to concentrate surplus from the countryside by borrowing money. In the 70s, there was oil boom and interest rates very, very low. And then Brazil, Argentina, everybody, and Poland, they all borrow extensively from these offshore banks in the petrodollar, the recycling of petrodollars. And in the end, when interest rate on US dollar and interest rate in general hiked to 20% in early 1980s, that all these developing countries and socialist countries plunged into debt crisis. And China in the 70s, and lucky enough, or because of the stubbornness of Mao, that refused to borrow this money. And of course, there's more complicated story in it. I don't have time because of this, the easing of the Cold War, and normalization of U.S., China, and China-Japan relation, and Japan also give a lot of financial assistance and to China. So, and all factors add together that China didn't borrow in the 70s, though it has this option. So by the early 1980s, China was free from external debt. So it is all this kind of a Mao legacy. That is one of the, it is a conservative estimation. That is agricultural economists in China estimate. It's very conservative, but it's still impressive. That is this rural-urban surplus transfer through the price seizures. That is how a kind of approximate measurement of how much resources are sucked out from the rural sector to finance urban industrialization. And the absolute number it's difficult to judge how big it is, but as a percentage of agricultural output, that it starts from less than 10% to 1970s. Of course, there's a Great Leap disaster that's a negative, meaning that there's nothing coming out from the rural sector, but there's still some, it's a lead transfer. But by the 70s, so 20%. So provided that the Chinese agriculture is not very advanced and you might say even near subsistence level, that to squeeze 20% of the agricultural output to support industrialization is quite a big deal. And at the same time, you look at this indebtedness, the foreign debt as a percentage of GDP, all this country that is troubled by the debt crisis in the 80s, because in the 70s, by the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, right before the debt crisis hit, they're all heavily indebted externally, including actually Poland, also heavily indebted and Yugoslavia, and many Eastern, and some people even argue that the collapse of the socialist system in Eastern Europe actually started with this kind of debt crisis, particularly in Poland. They're insolvent by the end of the 1980s because of this external debt. So this Mao period foundation is important. Without this Mao period, that of course that the China boom is not possible. But I'm not saying that it is a lateral outgrowth of this Mao foundation. The Mao foundation just laid the foundation and condition for the real China boom to start in the 1980s and 1990s. And the two main engines of the China boom, one is the export sector. It is very well known. Actually, it is more trist than that the export sector really didn't started until 1994 around. That before 1994 and 1992, 93, people forgot, but actually it's quite interesting that China actually has a balance of payment crisis. That is kind of a trade deficit and so on and so forth. And in 1994, Zhu Rongji, not yet a premier, but the vice premier, but he's already took charge of economic policy and then devalued the yuan aggressively. And then I caught him in the policy pitch and saying that too much resources are diverted to the township and village enterprises that serve the domestic market. It's no good. So let us squeeze them and let them die. And then once this township and village enterprise declined, it released all this rural labor going to Dongguan and other places in the foreign factories. So in the 1980s, and China economy is still pretty much domestic consumption driven relatively, and the export boom started in the 1990s. And when of course, Hong Kong manufacturers already moved to some pockets of South China in the 1980s, and 1990s they moved in full force, and then the Taiwanese came in as well. And then this foreign capital came to China and met the low cost, and they're not only low cost labor, as I said, because of the Mao legacy, which is actually that legacy is dying off because of the problem of education, rural healthcare, public healthcare nowadays. But in the 1990s, that the legacy is still around. That is this labor. It's not only abundant and cheap, but also healthy and literate. It makes a big deal. And then you look at all these Asian industrialists, they would say that it is easy to train, and they are, of course, there's some kind of Orientalist. Always that they are docile by nature because of this patriarchal. There's something in it, but more so that they're used to this kind of disciplined labor, and they are literate, educated, and healthy. So it is a big deal. So it is the export sector, and of course that we read a lot about this running out of surplus labor, the Lewis turning point literature, and so on and so forth. And the reality is more complicated than that. That first of all, that even though China labor cost is rising rapidly after 2005 and so on, but compared to earlier East Asian economy, is still rising much slower than the others. Of course, because of the pool of the rural labor is much bigger than the rural labor in Japan and Four Tigers when they started. Singapore and Hong Kong didn't have rural labor to talk about at all, and we are talking about Korea and Taiwan. So that's low cost advantage of China in particularly important for the export sectors, and it stay on for much longer time than anybody else. And actually there's the Lewis turning point, there's still debatable. That many people claim that the Lewis turning point has started, that the rural labor has run out, but actually that some economists and demographers, and there's a report in IMF and saying that the Lewis turning point actually will not come until 2020, 2025. So we are not yet there, and the recent rising, the recent rural ethnography and labor ethnography coming out and telling the story, a more complicated story about why we see labor wage increase in many coastal manufacturing towns. And so it has a lot to do with the fact that under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they invest a lot of money into the rural infrastructures and also in the southwest inland, and then it creates job opportunities that may not pay as much as the coastal town, but many rural surplus labor nowadays, they rather to stay in a place closer to home for a little lower wage rather than going all the way to Guangdong or Jiangsu. So it is these dynamics that create a kind of labor shortage and wage increase. So it is why that many companies, manufacturers in coastal China, one way to cope with it is to go to Vietnam and other places, but the other way is to go to inland. That there's still surplus labor there, but they are now, the calculation changed a little bit. They are more reluctant to go far away, and then they stay behind. So this low-cost rural labor stay on, and of course that it met with the legacy of Mao, that is the good infrastructures and health, public health, and literacy, and all these conditions. So as I said in the book, that basically the China boom is, in one sense, a kind of explosion set off by mixing two originally separated ingredients, separated by the Cold War, that is the Mao legacy and the East Asian capitalism, that when they put the two together, you create an explosion. And you look, now we have iPhone 7, but iPhone 4 is very outdated. But the things get outdated much quicker nowadays. When I'm finishing the manuscript, only the iPhone 4 data is available, but I try to look very tangentially that it didn't change a lot. That is of course, there's a lot of effort on the part of the Chinese government and local enterprises and so on and so forth to pursue industrial upgrading and innovation and moving to high tech, but it is just starting, and it is not as big a leap as we have in our common perception. For example, everybody know that iPhone came out from China, but you look at the breakdown of the components, most of the high-tech parts is actually made in Korea, made in Germany, made in Italy, Japan, and then they ship the components to China. And China mostly take care of the labor-intensive part, that is to put them together. It is still, you still need sophisticated skill to do it, but it is the breakdown of the cost of an iPhone 4 at that time, $600, and then the assembly cost is about $6.54, and all these costs are components that is made somewhere else. And of course, the China's government policy is always to set up this. Is one of the origin of many foreign manufacturers nowadays in China is that they are setting up regulation and policy to make sure that these people who put things together in China will drag their supplier to China too. So rather than import components from foreign countries, that China is setting up a regulatory environment to learn and to pressure this final manufacturer of the final product to pull in the supply of the components too. And it is a kind of a constant tug of war. It is the origins of many of these WTO lawsuit and campaign, counter-campaign, whether it is violation of free trade, and to set up this regulation and so on and so forth. So this is a long story. But the story is that the export sector in China is still one of the engines, of course, and then it is changing, but it's still relying on low-cost, high-quality labor relatively. And the other engines of the China boom is, of course, the very well-known state sector, local government, state enterprises, that they got all these low-cost credit, low-interest loans from state bank, and to fill the investment spree, that is constructing airports and new subway line after new subway lines, and new apartment complexes and new shopping mall, and all this construction is another very important important driving force of the China boom. And this kind of low-cost credit, of course, has something to do with the fact that CCP control the state bank and control the state enterprises, and so that through this connection between the managers of the state enterprise or local government and the managers in the state bank, they can get a lot of these easy loans. And after 2008, one of the main thrusts of the stimulus to rescue China from the global financial crisis, of course, is to open the floodgate to dictate the state bank, you have to lend money. And then most of the money, of course, goes to these state sectors that use this money to build things. And what I try to argue is that these twin engines, and in the end, is one engine, that is the export, because people didn't realize that why the state bank sector can create so many credit, create so many money supply. And in for example, in Southeast Asia, on the eve of the Asian financial crisis, that there's also this kind of a credit rapid expansion, and in the end, it led to a currency crisis. In China, it not yet led to a spectacular financial currency crisis. Some people are arguing that it is coming, but at least in the last 20 years, they have this kind of loan creation, money supply creation, liquidity creation like crazy. But still, without the kind of currency crisis, financial crisis of a Southeast Asian financial crisis, because that this new loan creation and new money creation in the bank center is supported by equally rapidly expanding foreign exchange reserve that originate from the export sector. So there's a calculation that people might disagree about what is the sufficient level, but the outstanding, the money supply to foreign exchange reserve, the foreign exchange reserve to M2 ratio should be like a lot lower than 20%, and then you are safe. And then China is always above 20%, meaning that this printing of money to stimulate the economy is not out of thin air. It is backed by expanding foreign exchange reserve. And then most of the source of the expansion of the foreign exchange reserve is, of course, from the export sector, foreign capital and export. Of course, this is changing now that the foreign exchange reserve, if you keep track of, has plunged from nearly because I'm flipping back and forth between the Chinese figures and the U.S. kind of denominated figures, I always have trouble figuring out the trillion and billion thing. But so it is about 400 trillion to 32 40 to 32. That has in 1 year, in the last year. So the China foreign exchange reserve is contracting. And then it creates a vicious circle that there's a capital flight and devaluation and so on and so forth. So we'll see. But so far, that this twin engines, and of course, you look at this under these twin engines and all these China giants that they're mostly state-owned enterprises by revenue in the global fortune because of the availability of this easy credit from state banks, so they can buy assets and expand easily and then become some of the top global companies. And they are not efficient at all. And it is even from the official data, you can find out that the profit rate of state-owned, state-holding enterprises is much lower than the private enterprises. And also many of these private enterprises, and particularly enterprises funded by Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, and foreign investment are export manufacturing or in the service sectors. So this that is an old story that many people talk about. That is this inefficient state-owned sectors, state-owned enterprise sector versus the private sectors and export-oriented foreign capital driven sectors. That so according to the people, the liberals like the Justin Lin Yifu, that they are right to saying that now there is this problem. This in their terminology is a misallocation of capital, that because the banking system favor this relatively unprofitable and low efficiency state sector, while the efficient sector, the well-known example is of course the Wenzhou manufacturers. They are very efficient, innovative, but they don't have a lot of access to finance and has to resort to this kind of informal financing, which is risky and creating a lot of problem nowadays. So it is two engines of China, and it's also the engine for a lot of different countries in the world. It is the figures from my book, and I try to draw it myself, but the publisher keeps saying that it is not up to the standard. So they make me to pay like $200 for a contractor they recommend to create this graph, which is quite about the same as the one that I create myself. And so to get the most value out of this $200, I never miss any opportunity to show this graph. And so basically this is how the China boom is driving the world economy up to recently, and still, and now it is in the reversal, but that China is exporting the final product mostly to Europe and North America. There's a lead great surplus, and then the other East Asian economies are exporting components to China. And then, of course, Africa, Australia, Latin America, and exporting raw materials to fuel the manufacturing and the investment boom. So it is why that after 2008, many people look to China as a new savior of the world economy, because when Europe and America tanked, and then China continued to become a big driver of Brazil and Venezuela and Australia, and they are really unsquashed by the global financial crisis because of the China demand. But of course, now that they are in trouble, like Brazil and Venezuela, it's very telling. And I may be running out of time, but the last thing that is what about the private consumption, household consumption. That actually it is interesting, the story about underconsumption in China, not in absolute terms, but as a share of GDP, has been around since 1999. And then you can first find the policy speech by the Chinese official at that time, of course, Zhu Rongji, about expanding domestic consumption demand as a way to restructure the Chinese economy. You can find it in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. In 1998-99, they talk about it until now. That they never stop talking about it, but the household consumption as a share of GDP continue to drop. And it is not inevitable, and it's not normal. You look at the data that in the 1980s, actually China economy quite balanced in the way that it is the household consumption is driving the growth in a bigger way than now. And also Indian economy is more household private consumption driven, so it is less dependent on external demand. But China, you see this consumption boom, of course, but as a percentage of GDP, the share is dropping, and of course there are many theory, and I think it's wrong-headed, because the dominant theory, like World Bank and many economies would be saying, is that it is a saving culture. that restrain the consumption boom, that people just like they don't know how to enjoy life, they save too much, and then so change the culture. Or in a more sophisticated view, that is about the social welfare. They worry about retirement, they worry about college education, so they save a lot. It has some truth in it, but you look at the data, and actually that China has a high saving rate, but you look at it, actually the majority of the saving is enterprise saving and government saving. That the household saving is a shrinking and small part of it. That of course that you can still do a lot by mobilizing that saving by improving the safety net and things like that. But the larger part of the story is actually you look at the GDP per capita growth in China. It is in nominal term, not in real term. It is rising like this. But if you look at the average household income per capita growth, it is only rising like this. So it's a big gap there here. And then the household consumption per capita growth is basically it's in line with the household income growth, meaning that so GDP per capita, you divide your GDP by the population, but the actual average household earning is much smaller than the GDP per capita, because a lot of this fruit of economic growth is distributed in the form of profits and interest and all this rather than income, household income of ordinary people. So in the end, it is the kind of a distribution issue, that there's a lot of policy bias toward, it's like in the US, and you look at wage as a percentage of GDP is declining, while profit as a percentage of GDP is increasing. And it happened maybe even in a more exaggerated way in China, that the wage has, as a percentage of GDP, have been dropping. It's rising, but as a percentage of GDP is dropping, but profit as a percentage of GDP is rising. So it is, in the end, it is kind of a distribution question. This is why it is so difficult to tackle. And it has a lot to do, and I can go on and on to talk about all these examples, but one example, my favorite, is that after 2008 financial crisis, one stimulus package that the government at that time pointed at is to give consumption voucher to peasants to buy white goods and computer and things like that. So the original policy is to directly give consumption voucher to put it in hand, put purchasing power in the hand of the farmers and the rural population, and let them buy things. And after intensive lobbying by all these manufacturers, and then the policy changed. They still have stimulus, but the stimulus money go to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer use the stimulus money to offer discount to rural buyers of the goods. And of course, that they still have discount, but they cut a big corner. So in the end, that these manufacturers get more profits out of it, and then and then of course, in many enterprises have this little gold safe themselves, and then they use this extra money to speculate in real estate and all kind of things. So it is why there's this structural difficulty in rebalancing the economy. So probably I need to end in like 5 minutes or so. Yeah. So it is the saving composition of saving, that household is shrinking a little bit, but you see that the government saving and corporate saving is a large part. And in the end, that you have these economic structures that is export has been rising, investment as a percentage of GDP has been rising, household consumption is dropping, it's very familiar. And then after the financial crisis, export lowered down, and then investment became really the sole engine that when export slowed down. So it became a problem, because the investment, the debt-filled investment has been expanding without any problem so far, because it was backed by the foreign exchange reserve expansion originated by a very prosperous export sector. When the export sector got into a slowdown, and then the foreign exchange reserve the growth start to slow, and now they actually reverse as it's shrinking now. And then this continuous investment spree financed by credit get into the situation like Southeast Asia before 1998. That is this kind of credit crisis, or at least difficulty might be coming. So the prospect of China growth is, of course, it's just export growth is slowing because of the lingering global economic crisis. You look at this manufacturing purchasing manager index for manufacturing, that there's ups and downs every month, and then it is a measurement of expansion or contraction. And the figure above 50 represent expansion in manufacturing activities, and then figure below, it is a lead indicator because it is kind of based on survey of manager to look at the purchasing order. And the figure below 50 represent contraction. So you see that it has been heavily expanding until the global financial crisis, and then it dropped, and then the stimulus came in, and then everything go back in a high-speed mode in 2010, 2011, and then it continued to drop, and then there's a lot of up and down, but now it's lingering at the 50, which is stagnation. That is neither expanding nor contracting. Of course, that people look at the service PMI, find that it is better, but the service sector in relation or in comparison with the export sector and manufacturing export sector and the investment sector is still small, so it is not able to make up the slack yet. So it is the state of the Chinese economy, and now that talk of the press, financial press nowadays, also and the Bank of International Settlement just published a report saying that China is heading to a credit crisis. And of course, that this kind of prediction comes and goes, but when BIS is talking about it, you better listen, because it successfully and rightly predict the credit bust in Japan in the 1990s and the subprime crisis in 2008. So now they're talking about the situation of China, that that field investment-driven growth is no longer sustainable because the size of the outstanding debt is approaching 300% of GDP. Again, that different people have different estimations. Some saying that's 260, some saying that's 280, but it's approaching 300. And on top of a shrinking of foreign exchange reserves. So it creates all this pressure of capital flight that, and devaluation expectation. It fit into a kind of a vicious circle. And of course, that this investment, the economic benefit of investment is declining. That's each unit of GDP, each unit of investment can create less and less a unit of GDP growth. And of course, people are saying that China is still a poor country, has a lot of room to build its infrastructures, but there's always a time lag. But the problem is that before that the infrastructure build become profitable and useful, and before the deadline of your repaying the debt, that there's always a risk that you need to repay the debt before the infrastructure you build become profitable. If that gap is too big, that you go bust. And then this infrastructure, no matter how useful it is in the future, it doesn't help now. So it is the problem now, and this is one of my students compiled from the conference board data. That is the total factor productivity. That I don't want to go into details, but you look at this total factor productivity contribution to growth is now moving into negative, meaning that most of or even all of the China growth is driven by throwing more and more wood in the fire rather than increasing efficiency. So at the very last, that everybody agreed that the Chinese government or economies is boosting consumption share as a way out, but it is more difficult than it sounds, because now it is already rebalancing, already happening. You look at the data that domestic consumption is already increasing, but mostly through the shrinking of investment and export. And then so the economy look more balanced, but this rebalancing mainly through slowing investment and export has a kind of a problem, that is it create unemployment. That and this unemployment, if it drag on too long, it actually hurt consumption, and then the rebalancing can go off track. And of course, a more healthy way to do it is increasing consumption share through boosting the absolute speed of consumption growth. That, as I said before, it leads redistribution. It leads an increase in household income as a share of GDP. It's not only kicking people to let them learn how to spend like Americans. Even they want to do so, they don't have the means to do so. That first of all, that before everything else, you need to make them have the means to do so. So it is redistribution question. So the very last field, that but it's too much. That let me feel like 1 minute to finish this. That the last myth is about this kind of a China's is subjugating the U.S. as a new financial power. People look at 2008 trying to become the biggest external creditor to the U.S., surpassing Japan. And then all this discussion about what if China dump all the U.S. treasury bonds, and then U.S. will be going to hell, and all this thing will block and things like that. So we are kind of subjugated to the China's creditor as a master, and all this talk originate from this comparison with the episode of the U.S. replacing the U.K. as a world power in 1956. The Suez Canal crisis is that after the Second World War, that U.S. become the biggest creditor to the U.S. They bought a lot of U.K. bond. So during the Suez Canal crisis, that U.K. and also France invade Egypt, and then U.S. try to pressure U.K. to back off. UK didn't want to back off, and then U.S. Resort to financial power. That is, threatened to dump UK bond in the market. In the end, that the UK underwent a kind of a financial crisis. In the end, they submit to the U.S. brokering of peace and then withdraw from the Suez Canal and Egypt. And then it is a moment when people say that this U.S. became a world power, displacing the UK through this threat of use of financial power. And then back in 2008, 2009, people talk about this, and that China can also do that to U.S., that threaten to dump U.S. Treasury bond to threaten U.S. in all geopolitical means. But the comparison is mistaken, because it is the question of what is the dominant currency in the world. In the 1956, everybody is using U.S. dollar. It is a dollar standard. So U.S. can do it to U.K. But in nowadays, that even though China is the biggest foreign creditor to the U.S., but our world is still in the U.S. dollar standards, and China is running a trade surplus only with the U.S. and European Union. With everybody else, actually China is running a trade deficit because they import more components and raw material than export to them. So the lead source of trade surplus for China exporters is U.S. and European Unions, and then of course in trying to trade with U.S. is settled in U.S. dollar. And not many people realize that despite all the talk about using RMB and things like that, currency swap, that many of, or even most of the Chinese export to European Union is settled in U.S. dollar too. Right after 2008, that financial crisis, some of the Chinese exporter to European Union start, and actually Jiangsu government sent directive to the manufacturer to ask suggest them to receive euro instead of US dollar in their settlement. But after a while, the Chinese government decided that the euro is more risky than US dollar. And then in 2010, 2011, they already telling the manufacturer, that's this local exporter province government, that you ask your customer in Europe to settle your trade in RMB, which is not quite viable because the RMB is not yet an international currency. So if they don't have RMB, tell them pay dollar, don't receive euro. And so in the end, that all these kind of China trade surplus and foreign exchange reserve is mostly denominated in the US dollar. So that there's no other choice than buying US Treasury bond. So in this sense, that this China's financial power is less than meet the eyes. That despite all this trying to talk about they are dumping the US Treasury bond, they lost faith in US Treasury bond. But between 2008 and 2013, that China holding of US Treasury bond doubled, and it stabilized at there. And then in the end, that so far as the world is still in a kind of a US dollar standard, that actually the global demand for US dollar is bigger than the supply. So in the last year or so, that China starting actually to dump US Treasury bonds, not because they want to penalize the US, but because they want to sell the US Treasury bond to save, to kind of contain the drop of the yuan. But nobody noticed, because the moment that they're trying to sell the U.S. Treasury bond, and then many more people come in to buy them, and still a safe haven. So there's the China's financial power vis-a-vis the U.S. Given by its U.S. Holding of U.S. Treasury bond is exaggerated, even false. That so it is wrong to conclude that with this Chinese creditor, biggest creditor, external creditor to the U.S. status can be translated into geopolitical power. Of course, China still try to play the game by not dumping U.S. Treasury bond, but by internationalizing the yuan. That unfortunately I don't have time to talk about it, but we can talk more about it in the Q&A. So I better stop here. Thank you.
First of all, China getting out of its sluggishness since 2008 this the same thing going on in China? China and other Asian countries always were good savers. But what is China doing to try to get the Chinese consumer to spend their way out of their sluggish economy?
Yeah, the U.S. has been have a negative saving rate until the financial crisis, and actually, you look at the data, the U.S. saving rate is going up very rapidly. That is saving again, the U.S. At aggregate level, and then yes, you're right that China has been saving, as I said, that the households are saving, but also more saving go to the saving in corporate and local governments and all levels of government. So as a policy prescription, I would say redistribution, as I said in the presentation, is necessary to boost the consumption of China. But of course, that without this happening, that China consumption is already rising, but not fast enough to pick up the slack given by the sluggishness of the other sectors in export and investment. So more need to be done. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can see how there's a consumption problem at home, so one way to address that is exports.
Yeah.
And what you're saying, I heard you saying that they're having a problem with the exports, and that's creating
Yeah.
Depressive economic tendency. But from what I could see from the charts, it looked like the exports are doing really well. And you look at the
This is foreign exchange reserve. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
some of the other tables, there was a
Yeah.
huge drop at the financial crisis.
Yeah.
But it seems to have gone back up.
Yeah.
So I guess I was hearing one story and I was seeing something that for me looked a little different. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, and China export is not doing as well as like before 2008. That is not saying, I'm not saying that China export is really collapsing. It's still doing well relative to other countries and so on and so forth. But the problem is that all these moving parts need to put together to make the whole thing work. That China export is still growing, though is much slower than before. But at the same time, because of this slowing export, there's a slowing and even shrinking of the foreign exchange reserve, and then and also it created capital flight that aggravated the problem. At the same time, that China is still using this kind of credit expansion to fuel investment to pop up the economy. That the problem is that when you create so much credit growth, that the foreign exchange reserve that is originated from export doesn't keep up, so it creates risk, a systemic risk in the credit sector. So the China GDP is still growing at like 6 to 7% if you believe in the official figure, and it's still a decent rate. That's but it is all in relative, because you look at the credit growth. The last year, in the last 12 months, the credit growth is 12%. So it is double the GDP growth. The result is that you only look at one figure, maybe export, maybe just GDP growth, it looks fine, definitely. But if you look at the credit growth, it is much bigger than this growth. And then when the credit growth is, the speed is double of the growth of the aggregate GDP growth, that you have this problem of increasing debt to GDP ratio that the Bank of International Settlement and all these financial analysts is scared about. So it is, yes, the export is not collapsing. Nothing is collapsing. But you put everything together, the risks get bigger and bigger. My short answer.
I have a two-part question. One thing that you did not address in your talk is demographics and the changing composition of the labor force in the Chinese population. And so to what degree do you think the so-called end of the demographic dividend that's coming very shortly in China is going to impact the trajectory going forward and the end of the China boom? And whether the increase in consumption will be able to keep pace with the changing composition of the population. And secondly, I want to address something that you ended on, and that is the question of the internationalization of the renminbi. To some extent, what you've been talking about with the debt-fueled crisis is simply an attempt to defend the value of the renminbi by sterilizing the inflows of foreign capital and also the purchase of U.S. securities. To what extent, and internationalization has been a major policy thrust up until the financial crisis, and maybe immediately thereafter. To what extent do you think the trap that they're in right now impacts the plans to loosen capital controls, and then to project China's power? Because as you said, in 1956, the world was already on a dollar standard, and that's what gave the U.S. power. The fact that the world is not on a renminbi standard even remotely, I think affects China's projection of power also.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. I answered the internationalization question first because it's part of the thing that I prepared to talk about, but I don't have time, but thanks very much for asking. That, yes, China is trying to break the US dollar's standard and hegemony by internationalize the renminbi. Of course, that China is not as hot-headed as they think that the world can turn to a renminbi standard. So what they think about is at least renminbi, if renminbi can have the status of yen, for example, that some of this trade can be settled in renminbi. So it's why China has been doing this currency swap with Argentina and all these places so that to increase the pool of renminbi outside of China. So these people who hold renminbi can, when they buy Chinese goods, they don't need to pay US dollar, they pay renminbi. So it is the plan. That is, but the reality is that the China is in a kind of dilemma because to have a fully intellectualized renminbi, to have kind of a huge demand in overseas to hold renminbi, that you need to make the currency easily and freely convertible so that I hold on to this currency. I know that if I want to change it to other currency, it is easy to do. But now that the Chinese financial system is closed or semi-closed, the holding onto a huge amount of renminbi, you cannot quite easily get to China to invest, and if you invest, it's quite difficult to get it out. And so it is the limited expansion of the amount of renminbi because it is not yet freely and easily convertible. And why China is hesitate, and many people in China, there's like a 30 financial forum, there's a think tank of all these financial analysts and state bank retired officials and things like that. They've set up a forum think tank to advocate total convertibility in the long run of renminbi. But why the Chinese government is hesitant to actually pursue it, at least not pursue it rapidly, is political. Because now the CCP, what I see is that the CCP, one very key foundation of CCP rule, if not the only most important foundation of CCP rule, is it control of credit. That is control of bank, and then you need to look up to the state bank and the government and for credit, and this financial informal financing, private financing is still not very developed, and there's not much room for foreign banking to do finance in China. So for this political control, that if you loosen up the capital market totally and financial liberalization, full convertibility, that China will lose control of credit. If like foreign banks freely come to lend money, that nobody need to borrow from state bank, and so it is a political issue. So now they're kind of a remedy to is to develop a renminbi offshore market in Hong Kong. So to make kind of a semi-controlled flow of renminbi into Hong Kong, develop a huge pool of renminbi there, so people have whole renminbi can go to Hong Kong to invest in all these kind of renminbi denominated product. But it is working somehow, but it's still starting. You can look at the figure here. It is in November 2015. Is the IMF is based on this calculation to decide to give renminbi, to include renminbi into the SDR basket. And renminbi is ranked number 5, and but it's a distant 5th from the two big giants, US dollar and euro. So it's a long way to go. But among these 2.28% of renminbi users, actually 70% of these are in Hong Kong. And then now people are saying that all these renminbi holding in Hong Kong is not quite account set aside for financing trade and things. They're just speculation. People just speculating on the rise of renminbi. And then now it's already shrinking because the expectation reversed. So they're doing it, but it is a long way to go, and it has a complicated issue about how much China, because like 5 years ago, China is very confident to not only let Hong Kong to develop offshore renminbi offshore renminbi market, but they're talking about the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. That when it came out, and everybody's talking about it, now nobody remember that. And the Tianhai in Shenzhen, at the borderland of Shenzhen, and they've imagined about developing all this kind of a free trade zone, but in the end, they're so scared about the political implication of this kind of money leaking out and lost control of the finance, so it didn't go anywhere. So it's just Hong Kong, but it's still a small amount, and it is still a long way to go for the renminbi to internationalize, and particularly after the expectation of devaluation prevailed, the appreciation that the international holding of renminbi decreased. And even Venezuela, when the Chinese government years ago making loan to Venezuela, the original China deal is that I lend you in renminbi, and then you repay in barrels of oil. And then the Venezuela at that time is saying that, no, if you lend me in RMB, I'd rather not take the loan. And in the end, the deal is that half RMB and half US dollar, and then Venezuela get the loan. So it is complicated a long way. And then, of course, the AIIB is a device that China want to increase the use of RMB. That is the speculation. They are not saying that initially the AIIB, the loan is made in US dollars still. But people will expect that when time comes that they will use this AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank loan, to denominate more of this loan in RMB, so that to pump RMB out to these Central Asian and Southeast Asian countries, so increase the use of RMB. But they're thinking about doing it, but still a long, long road. And also demographic problem. I'm not a demographer, so I'm looking it into detail enough, but I believe that the demographic actually, it is not yet the kind of determining factor to the China growth story. That it is beginning, but it's not yet in full force, because there's so many labor affluency, rural affluency. Some of it done of our students show that actually in the rural area there's still is not yet a very serious problem. I mean the deficiency of rural labor. The problem is that now the migration decision has shifted. In 10 years, 20 years ago, everybody see that the only chance to have a living is to move out to Dongguan and to Kunshan and all these coastal towns to work in the factories. But nowadays, after Wu Jintao and Wen Jiabao policy shift to invest in the countryside and inland, that now, for example, Sichuan is the most example. That a lot of Dongguan labor came from Sichuan, and now Sichuan, Chengdu, and Chongqing starting to become manufacturing hubs, and many people just refuse to go a long way to Dongguan and then stay in Chengdu. It's not that the absolute amount of young people is going to run out. According to some estimate, is in 5 years, 10 years time, but it's not yet hitting. That now the predominant dynamic is still this kind of a rural, urban, and coastal inland migration decision. But I'm not saying that it does not matter. It's going to matter, but not yet in full force.
So maybe two more questions.
Yeah, that's two last question. Yeah.
Can I start it first?
Yeah.
You take the
Yeah,
two
yeah,
questions
okay.
together.
Yeah.
Can you help me to summarize from the title that you put that
Yeah.
the Chinese, basically you and Chinese, that why Chinese cannot rule the world? First question.
Yeah.
Let's summarize the simple to help me to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
Second, I know
Yeah.
this is not your expertise about
Yeah.
demographics.
Yeah.
But we know that men population is lower than women.
Yeah.
What will affect China
Yeah.
in the future?
Yeah. Okay. That you.
As you know, China is conducting supply-side structure reform.
Yeah.
So, as far as I know, Chinese government claims that they intentionally make China to have a middle and high-speed growth of the
Yeah.
GDP rather than keeping
Yeah.
high-speed
Yeah.
GDP growth.
Yeah.
Because one of the evidence supporting this opinion is that if you look at the M2 rate, after President Xi and primarily take charge of Chinese economics, the M2 rate decreased dramatically, especially in comparison with 2008 and 2009.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah.
They said the Chinese government intentionally to make China have a lower
Yes.
forced by the factor you mentioned.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. Thanks. First, the subtitle of the book, that why China will not rule the world. Actually, some people think that why it is even a question. That of course China is not going to rule the world. That the problem is that in 2008, many people do think that China will rule the world, and I try to disown this subtitle that the press put on me, but it is difficult, and I'm responsible. I'm not because I accept it. That when, for example, that the author that is very well known and actually very influential is propagating the idea that China will rule the world is Martin Jacks, who actually wrote a book called "When China Ruled the World." He's talking about the China becoming the real motor or the only motors and driver of economic growth, which is kind of true momentarily from 2009, 2010, 2011. That China really is, when Europe and US was in trouble, that Brazil, Australia, Canada, all African countries, they all look up to China as kind of a source of growth and only source of growth and for the demand for commodities. So it was true at that time, but it didn't last. That what I want to argue is that this China rule the world thing is exaggerated, and of course that I'm very careful not to be kind of categorized or seen as the same as a China collapse school. That one thing that I don't have time to talk about is the political implication of the slowdown. I'm pessimistic. There's always a prediction, and both predictions turn out to be wrong. That one is the middle class prediction, that when China middle class grow, people will ask for democracy and authoritarian rule can go away. It turned out to be wrong. That all these surveys showing that the middle class, urban middle class in China is the most conservative force in China. And one reason of it is that it's not backed up by survey data, but it's not the subject of my book, but just by talking to people and things like that. People who talk about this middle class association with democracies talk about these examples of Four Tigers and all these other places. What is different from China is that the urban middle class has a steep fear of the peasants, which is still the majority. They always they are very unhappy about the rural migrant in the cities and things like that. So they cannot imagine that one person, one vote would bring to what would it bring. So this deep fear of peasantry, contempt of peasantry, and among the urban middle class, even some of the liberal intellectuals, you talk to them, you feel that some even one of them even say that you don't easily call people Longmin. It is a kind of insulting word, that you are so Longmin and things like that. So it is this cultural bias or contempt and fear of the peasantry that make this urban middle class very conservative. And it is not the factor in Taiwan and South Korea and all these places, because the urban middle class, when they grow, that the peasantry is already dead, and then they don't have this big peasant that they fear. They imagine that when they have democracy, they are going to lead. But in the case of China, this kind of a deep contempt and the fear of peasantry. So it's why this middle class things didn't true. And also the economic collapse will lead to, or economic not collapse, and China is it's difficult for China to collapse the economically. It will slow down. It's a long slowdown. And the debt crisis and the central government still have enough fiscal resources. But it depends, that because many people compare China with Japan in post-1990s, that the government bailed out all these companies and turned them into zombies, and so it is a protracted, slow growth. But even Japan managed to do it because Japan has a deep, big, huge government bond market that China is starting to develop. And also the Japanese citizens are very religiously committed to, really religious to buy government bonds as their saving device. And Chinese government is trying to do it, that develop a government bond market, but it's still starting, and I'm not sure whether the China middle class or China saver will turn all their saving or most of their saving to China government bond, whether they have the trust on the Chinese government, I'm not sure. But they still have the means to bail out. And so the scenario would be a lot of economic collapse, but a kind of a long time stagnation without a new driver of growth. And you look at Russia, you look at North Korea, that the economic disasters, even the economic disaster didn't mean the end of the authoritarian rule. So the authoritarian resilience can withstand this economic slowdown. It's indeterminate, but I'm just putting kind of a pessimistic view to calm down many of my friends and colleagues who are excited about the prospect of economic slowdown could bring down the authoritarian rule. And regarding the supply side reform that Xi Jinping advocated, it's very interesting. That thanks for bringing it up. That Xi Jinping and at least his advisors talking about this supply side reform, meaning that you need to let the inefficient enterprise go bust, need to move to a moderate growth. So just like Reagan. So the whole terminology borrowed from Reagan, that is supply side reform, and even revolutions in the early 1980s, you create a recession, but it's temporary, and then after everything is sorted out, it grows again. I think this vision is right, but this is very difficult, and if in politically and economically. Politically, you can realize that the Roman Rebel, the People's Daily article, that is this kind of a special authoritative author writing in Roman Yibo to talk about the danger of creating too many credit, and the fantasy about using credit to perpetuate growth is dangerous, and advocated supply side reform. But the problem is that we see a split in the leadership here. There's a large chunk of the leadership, and some people say that is Li Keqiang. I'm not sure whether it's himself or, but I can easily understand that in the bureaucracy there's a worry that it is better to continue to use credit to push up growth temporarily, rather than delay the reform. That is the Xi Jinping on the supply side advocate is saying that it is no good, but they are doing it anyway. So politically, it seems that the supply side reform has a lot of talk in it, but in terms of the actual behavior of the bureaucracy, they are still, you look at the credit growth and loan growth, and still rising. So they are still stuck to this old role of using credit growth to pop up economic growth. And moderate growth in theory, of course, is inevitable and actually good for China, but to move from high-speed growth to moderate growth, it is not automatic, and there's a lot of challenges in the middle that you need to fix. For example, one thing is about the steel industry, that early in the year and last year, there's a lot of talk about, okay, let all this kind of excess capacity go away by letting the steel mill bust, and then all this kind of estimation about how many unemployment you created, and then it will lead to social instability, and then large-scale unemployment can eventually also drag down the economy further. So how you softly land the aircraft without crashing is not that easy. That definitely that landing is good. A soft landing is good. That from the 1998 financial crisis to nowadays is always good. But it needs a high-level craftsmanship or very sophisticated skill to engineer the growth to a stable moderate growth without creating a lot of unemployment and instability. If it creates instability and unemployment, it will actually lead to a lot of moderate growth, but actually dive further, and it will be disastrous. So it is very difficult. And the supply side reform, in principle, and then to the driving the economy to moderate growth is right, but it is very challenging politically and economically. It remains to be seen how it play out in the end.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks. Any questions?